Thank you so much, Paolo, for the introduction, and obviously thanks to the organizers for maintaining this event and hosting us under these difficult conditions. I want to say that maybe we ought to look at the bright side of things. This will be, after all, the lowest carbon footprint ESIL conference ever organized. So I think we can see this as our way of honoring our obligations of solidarity towards the oceans and the forests and the fauna that will not be devastated, so that we humans can discuss solidarity. Um, so let me also briefly suggest that a precondition of solidarity is knowing what one owes to the land one stands on, and knowing one's place in the world. And whilst I'm standing on Teams in cyberspace, which is a somewhat amorphous location, I also want to acknowledge that McGill University, my home institution, which you see in the virtual background, is situated on the traditional territory of Catania and a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. And so I am reminded also of the solidarity obligations that I continue to have with Indigenous struggles in my land of adoption, Canada. So obviously it's been mentioned already, there's a certain timeliness to the theme of solidarity. At a time when we are all kept apart, what is it exactly that keeps us together? And I dare say this is as relevant a theme for all societies, the Society of International Lawyers no less than the Society of States. And I for one, have a kind of renewed appreciation for our willingness to, struggle with our contradictions, overcome the obstacles of distance, and engage in this project and the promise that I think it still contains. So I was asked a few months ago to come up with a title, and I think I'm competing for the award of the most bland keynote title of the year. Solidarity between universalism and pluralism. I vaguely suspect that a version of this has been used many times before, but I think you'll see what I'm trying to get at, and I think what I did want to do is try to locate solidarity within our larger visions of international law. And I think it's very intriguing that, the topic came up even before the COVID pandemic made us brutally aware of some of the deficiencies of solidarity in the international system. And I think there's certainly a moment that is worth capturing, and I think says something about our current international legal predicament. So let me start with a fairly conventional account of international law, and I'll try to sort of see where solidarity fits in, if at all. International law, as we all know, is a product of a liberal imagination, and it has fluctuated over time between different visions of itself that seem at times, radically incompatible, and at times totally inseparable. And these two visions are what I call loosely a vision of international law as manifesting a kind of irreducible pluralism, and a vision of international law as committed to a certain universalism. So pluralism is perhaps international law's default Westphalian mode, if you want, the notion that the international system is one marked by radical moral and legal pluralism, irreducible sovereign entities that make up the international legal system. And that pluralism also upholds a kind of fundamental commitment to the diversity of the international system. And you can see how, in some ways it kind of excludes solidarity because of the way in which it reinforces a sense of each of these entities being autonomous and self-sufficient. But we all know the limits of pluralism as well, right? So that pluralism exhausts international law into a form of individualist anomia, and international society cannot exist with sovereigns who are merely sort of happily, as it were, turning their back to each other. So universalism or cosmopolitanism is the other complementary, occasionally default mode of international law. The idea that the international community is characterized by its unity, not so much its pluralism. Pluralism itself is entrenched and propagated through international law's own claim to universality. In addition, universality over time has thickened to the point, some would say, of being almost bloated. The cautious, tentative international law of pluralism is increasingly under the competition of an international law that proclaims with some confidence the advent of new and perhaps auspicious beginnings. Now, a claim to universalism and to cosmopolitanism is, I think, as necessary as it is problematic in international law. It keeps international law together, but it is equally exhausting as the claim to radical pluralism. It is, among other things, constantly belied by practice and a rather poor predictor of what goes on in the international system. And this is us international lawyers as the utopians permanently agitating in favor of these slogans, which, I'm afraid sometimes only us seem to take seriously, and which provoke only a kind of sneer among the more worldly or realist types of people who wield power in the international system. So, universalism, pluralism, it's a very familiar image. It's a contradictory but kind of self-sustaining image. Where does solidarity fit? And I think here there's clearly a kind of Loch Ness monster quality to solidarity, often spotted, its existence rarely conclusively established. Solidarity has again and again been hailed as a sort of magical ingredient to transcend both the anomia of pluralism and the abstraction of universalism. And I have to say, I mean, the concept is intuitively plausible and, in fact, quite appealing. One, all systems, all social systems, require its members to behave as if they did indeed belong to a society. Okay? Two, being a member of a society is about more than being law-abiding. It is also about positively contributing to that society. And I think that last point is key. Probably domestically as well. A society of merely law-abiding citizens would be a rather sad society, right? We need society to be energized through participation, through a kind of embrace that we associate with social virtues that go beyond merely respecting the law. I mean, if all that we ever did as citizens, to draw on the domestic analogy, was drive on the right side of the road and pay our taxes, but never, extend a kind of helping hand to our neighbor, then we would live in a kind of caricature of liberal individualist society that I think is quite unappealing as a model. So you can find that quite powerful notion that solidarity points to the sort of above and beyond, above and beyond law abiding in some international legal discourse. So my colleague here in Canada, Obiora Okafor, who is the independent expert on international solidarity, since we've been reminded there is quite extraordinarily such a thing, notes, for example, that the international refugee regime requires a true unity of purpose, a true spirit of unity of purpose, even beyond the contractual scope of the obligations that states assumed under the 1951 Convention, right? So I think the refugee regime is unworkable, merely as a regime of processing individual claims to persecution when people turn up at your border. as I think we have become increasingly aware, it requires a little more warmth in that, a little more reaching out, a little more organization with other states, rather than just this kind of passive law-abiding kind of attitude. So for international lawyers to wrap their mind around this, us who already have untold difficulties in getting states to abide by international law in the first place, is quite a feat, right? This requires, I mean, we spend 90% of our careers deploring how little sort of basic international law is complied with, let alone being in a position to our states to go above and beyond international law. But I think that's really what solidarity potentially is about. But I do note that there's something about solidarity that maybe is particularly appealing in the international system, given how centralized enforcement, has proved a very elusive and maybe illusory promise in international law. At least if we cannot enforce international law centrally, and I think the jury is out, but there are ample critiques of that view. Maybe we can at least rely on good citizenship and good neighborliness as sort of alternatives to this sort of top-down enforcement. And so, re-injecting our vision of international law with that vision of horizontal solidarity, good citizenship is maybe a promising and mature utopia for international law at this stage. But I should stress that the suspicion that this is the missing ingredient in international law, in the alchemy of international law, has been rife and long-standing. So as often, we are only rediscovering some of the ideas of our forebearers, and the fact that this has been present in the development of international law for a very long time. As Vattel put it, and I'll say it in French because this is, after all, a bilingual society, and I am speaking from Quebec, but I'll provide a translation. As Vattel put it famously, la première loi générale que le but même de la Société des Nations nous découvrons est que chaque nation doit contribuer au bonheur et à la perfection des autres, tout ce qui est en son pouvoir. What an extraordinary statement, right? From Vattel, who's generally understood to have helped the transition to sort of classical international law, this idea that deep down, beyond everything else, the first law of a society of nations is that each nation must contribute to the happiness and the perfection of all others as far as it is in its power. I'm sure that would be music to the ears of some and quite surprising to others, right? Now, I think there's a distinct tradition of trying to conceptualize solidarity, and it's multiple and it's complex. But let me give you a quick run through. Of course, the French solidarists come to mind, right? That particular current born from sociology, and precisely an emphasis on the social comes to mind, and it runs through Durkheim, but also Bourgeois, and then in international law specifically, Georges Sel, who I think had the intuition. I'm not sure Georges Sel has aged particularly well. His thought has aged particularly well, but he intuited the existence of duties of solidarity as a result of living in society. And this was, of course, a powerful and maybe a prescient idea, the idea that agents already have duties because they can only exist in the first place as a result of other actors having duties and respecting them, right? So the idea that anything that we do, but anything that states do, is only made possible not by our freedom, as the liberal project imagines, but because the conditions for social life have been established in the first place by others, at whose on whom we are fundamentally dependent, right? So this is the solidarist intuition, and it mushrooms and it has ramifications throughout the 20th century. I would hesitate to describe it as dominant by any measure, but Sel has his descendants. Most recently, third world scholars. Mohammed Bejawi makes quite a lot of this idea of solidarity. More recently, Abdul Koroma, Canada's own R. St. J. MacDonald, Michel Virali, Rüdiger Wolfram, and many others have tried to systematize what I would describe as international legal solidarity. So there's a kind of cyclical recurrence of this theme, and the pattern of analysis is generally quite familiar, right? So, a lot of it is a sort of norm entrepreneurship, where at some point an international lawyer says, someone hasn't looked at solidarity for a decade. Maybe it would be a good time to resurrect the principle. How do I go about doing this? Well, in the familiar way that international lawyers try to prove anything, first, one nod to realism. We are not quite there. I acknowledge that solidarity is more of an ideal than an actual legal principle. And then one nod to utopia. It would be really important for solidarity to be recognized as an international legal principle, or solidarity is inherent and implicit, more for sort of naturalist notion, going back all the way to Vattel, and in a sense, sort of closing that loop, that solidarity must exist, otherwise there wouldn't be an international system, and because there is an international legal system, there must be solidarity somewhere out there. So my propos today is not going to be that international solidarity does not exist in law and practice. I think it's reflected today, and I look forward to our discussions in the next 2 days. That it exists, it's incorporated in certain branches of international law. Think of international environmental law, and particularly how we are supposed to deal with global warming. The idea that each state should do its share. And I think there are moments, there are Marshall plans. There's, I don't know, Germany opening its borders briefly to waves of immigrants and refugees, or Lebanon for that matter. There are moments of solidarity. But let me say that I think there's a problem with the kind of dominant international lawyers concept of solidarity, that which is most often propounded in international legal discourse. And I want to flag 3 problems, which I think really make it problematic and difficult to grapple with. First, the emphasis in international legal discourse is on global solidarity, right? A solidarity of all with all, focused on the common good of the world community and cooperation for the international system at large, a form of cosmopolitan solidarity. But, I think that asks a bit too much of solidarity. It stretches solidarity to a kind of vanishing point. It dissolves it into the kind of abstract embrace of the international system. I don't think it's that one cannot be in solidarity with the entire world or with the international community, but that image becomes a little too abstract to be meaningful. And in particular, it deprives solidarity of what I'm going to emphasize as a key element, which is the relational element, which is the fact that one is always in solidarity with a particular other, rather than in a sort of wholesale embrace of the cosmos. Second problem with the dominant legal concept of solidarity is it's a juridified solidarity, a solidarity not of spontaneity, not of empathy, but of doing one's share as a result of a pre-existing international legal script. The idea, is that solidarity is actually really already in some way an obligation under international law. And so this is, of course, a very important theme in international law writing about solidarity, right? Why would international lawyers write about solidarity if not to tell us that, oh, it's now become a legal principle. This is what we do, right? If it's not a legal principle, if it's just a thing out there, we are relatively less interested in it. So one can see such efforts in, I don't know, the attempts to legislate the new international economic order in the 70s, the move towards constitutionalizing community interest, or more recently, because there is also such a thing, the Declaration on the Right to International Solidarity. So all of these efforts go to telling us solidarity is a thing in international law. And my worry here is that the juridified vision of international solidarity kind of takes the fun out of solidarity as an ethical category based on empathy and reaching out rather than just complying, right? So I think there's an emotional and an ethical dimension to solidarity, but it's just not captured by this sort of commanded, top-down version of international legal solidarity. Third problem with the legal vision of solidarity, it's often undifferentiated, right? It's the solidarity that all owe regardless of their position. And in the process of highlighting that solidarity, I think there's a risk, because it's so large, that international lawyers will also dissolve it. Because if you make something the responsibility of all, I think, I fear you also make it the responsibility of no one in particular, and perhaps more problematically, you hide the fact that obligations of solidarity are not entirely symmetrical and are not entirely equally distributed, right? So the sort of bland vision of every state in the international community has obligations of solidarity doesn't fully satisfy me, because I think there are states that over the centuries have accumulated significantly more debts of solidarity than others. And so we want to be attentive to that kind of distributive economy. So I think all of these deficiencies of a sort of dominant legal vision of solidarity make a bit fatal to its usefulness. And at the risk of stating the obvious, I think if the COVID pandemic has taught us one thing, it is in fact the limits of that cosmopolitan model. And I'm the first one to hope that COVAX, for example, will get its act together, but it is clearly off to a slow start, and it's hard not to see it as intrinsically limited, right? So even as we all see the need for solidarity, we also see the kind of the bankruptcy of the international system in that respect. And appeals to Western states' interest, for example, in getting as much of a global population vaccinated as possible, I think miss that solidarity cannot be fully subsumed under a rational interest framework either, right? So I think we should resist the notion that solidarity is the rational thing to do, because if that's the case, then we don't need solidarity. We can just rely on rationality and states knowing what actually is good for them. Before the COVID pandemic, we had, of course, had the migrant crisis, in which we witnessed the spectacle of countries, even and maybe a fortiori within the European Union, which is supposed to be a mechanism of solidarity in theory, falling over each other, right, to push the problem of refugees and migrants on others. And this is not to mention the global climate crisis, where the least one can say is it's not clear what solidarity might mean beyond incantation. And even when it comes to collective security, which is often heralded as a kind of paragon of solidarity, it's not clear that the UN Charter's collective security regime has worked much as a solidarity regime. It has worked in many ways as a system of kind of hegemonic governance, but I would hesitate to say that, with a few exceptions, that it has really worked along the lines that solidarity would suggest. So, everywhere we look, a tendency to offload the costs of certain policies on others, beggar thy neighbor policies that reminders, frankly, of the 1930s that are facilitated as much as they are limited by international law, right? Who should we believe then? The international law of sovereignty or the international law of solidarity? Let's always remember that, none of this happens without international law, and deficiencies in solidarity are as much a product of international law as they are something that international law seeks arguably to resist. So the solidarity I'm interested in is not this very thinly stretched, elusive version of solidarity. Contra universal, juridified solidarity, I want to introduce and discuss what I call actually lived solidarity. The solidarity spontaneously expressed by particular agents vis-a-vis other particular agents at particular times. So you'll notice that particular is the kind of key here. This solidarity of particular agents with particular agents does not purport to be a permanent or structural condition of the international system, nothing that grand. Rather, it is a practice, right? And we had echoes, right, in the introduction this morning of the idea that solidarity, before it was a legal principle, was an idea, right? Well, I'd like to say, probably solidarity was never really an international legal principle. But aside from being an idea, it's also been a practice. It's also been something that particular people have engaged in over time. And I am interested in taking these practices seriously. I think these practices, I would describe them as the occasional lightning that strikes the international system and temporarily, fugitively, in the moment and for those parties, creatively resolves the tension between pluralism and universality. Never twice in the same way. And the point here is that solidarity as a practice kind of acts on the universal promise of international law, but in peculiar ways, right? Hence the sort of the element of reconciliation, fleeting as it may be, between the universal and the peculiar. Now, I want to, in the time that remains, this might sound a bit theoretical. I want to give a few examples of what I have in mind. So I want to start with a kind of sacred cow of international lawyers. So consider international lawyers' long cherished, sort of adored idea that certain obligations are erga omnes, from the Barcelona traction case to the ILC's article on state responsibility. So you might say, erga omnes obligations are in a way the culmination of juridified international solidarity, right? The idea that certain violations affect all states. So what a wonderful idea, right? And it's a powerful idea, no doubt, possibly a structuring one. But I think the discussion of erga omnes obligation by us as a profession is also a kind of colossal monument to legal fiction, right? And compare for one moment the volumes written on erga omnes obligations, right? I mean, we really do write quite a lot. Compare that with actual pure instances of states acting upon erga omnes obligations as if they were effectively erga omnes, right? And here I think there's something like a kind of causalist fallacy, right? The idea that the mere fact that some obligations are erga omnes produces solidarity in the international system, that erga omnes obligations will kind of enchant the world towards greater solidarity, that, just naming them that will sort of engender the sort of world that the concept presupposes. But in reality, erga omnes obligations really describe, if anything, a possibility rather than an obligation. One way in which one might react to certain violations, what Natasha Nedelsky in a recent piece described as optional solidarity. At best, obligations to not recognize, let's say, a situation of occupation. But, can solidarity really be manifested by abstention, right? mean, in the real world, we would never say, well, I fulfilled my solidarity obligations by sort of not doing anything and not recognizing a bad situation. Surely, the point of solidarity is that it drives you into doing something more positive, more active. So, I think there's something to the ICJ's old dictum that states can be held to have a legal interest in the protection of erga omnes obligations. They can be held, that's one possible vision, but it doesn't mean that they feel that way or that they take that quite very seriously. States may be theoretically injured by a violation of an erga omnes obligation, but in reality may hardly feel the sting of that injury. It may be happening thousands of miles away, and it's entirely fictitious to say that they're really affected by it. I mean, except as a technical way to argue that you have standing, which is not nothing. But the idea that it sort of prompts you to act, I think, is really misguided. And so, there's a quality of abstraction to all of this, in short. It reminds me a bit of crimes against humanity, right? So the idea of crimes against humanity, a wonderful creation of the international legal mind. So sure, crimes are committed against humanity, but they're also committed against particular persons who are much more likely to feel the incidence of those crimes and to particular communities, etc. So, to the extent that erga omnes obligations are acted upon, it is because some states are more affected by their violations than others. And I think really the concept tells us more about certain conceptual debates within international law than about the nature of solidarity such as it might be in the international system. That is, right, until a state acts as if obligations are really erga omnes. Not necessarily because, it saw that their erga omnes obligations and said, well, surely we must be doing something since an erga omnes obligation was violated, but because for some other reason that state is in solidarity with whoever was harmed. And let me give you a few examples. So consider the famous but relatively few cases where a state has begun litigation against another, particularly before the International Court of Justice, on what seemed to be on the basis of what seemed to be the violation of erga omnes obligations. So I'm thinking of a Greek case before the European Commission on Human Rights brought by Scandinavian countries and the Netherlands during the dictatorship of the colonels, and the Southwest Africa case brought by Liberia and Ethiopia against South Africa, or even the Portugal versus Australia case on East Timor. Now, if you look at those cases, you can choose them to see them as manifesting the advent of a form of universal solidarity, even independently of their success. But that tells you nothing about why this country, in relation to this other country at that time, brought the case. Why the solidarity here and then? Surely it's not simply because the obligation violated was erga omnes. That, of course, facilitates these cases being brought, but it does not explain how these cases were brought. So, I think there's a tendency by international lawyers to start from the concepts to sort of explain what's going on, and this is a strangely formalistic exercise where I think the concepts are at best enabling of something that has an origin elsewhere than the concept itself. So what I suggest is we look at actual practices of solidarity. If you want to understand erga omnes litigation before the ICJ, you need to understand the actual political trajectories of solidarity that make this possible. And rather than see those patterns of solidarity as kind of quirky historical facts to be relegated at the margin, you have to see them as kind of absolutely essential and normatively salient. So the Greek case, well, Nordic social democracy and the Greek left within an early context of European solidarity. The Southwest Africa case, Pan-African solidarity, the anti-apartheid struggle as the indispensable background to what was going on. Portugal in the case of East Timor and its historical duties as the former colonial power. Similar actual solidarities manifest themselves in advisory opinions, right? Despite the fact that these opinions are presented as merely the General Assembly as a body asking for legal advice, in practice, you cannot understand the nuclear advisory opinion without understanding the actual solidarities of states whose territory has been used, for example, for nuclear testing, and you cannot understand the advisory opinion on the wall in the occupied territories, of course, without understanding Palestinian solidarity. So, there will inevitably be cases that perhaps more readily approximate conditions of universal solidarity. Think of Gambia versus Myanmar, maybe tomorrow a case against Syria. Nonetheless, even there, I think an understanding of who exactly is being in solidarity with whom helps. For example, Gambia, I don't think is merely a crusader for some abstract conception of the international community that is going to sort of re-enchant a universalist conception of erga omnes obligations. It's also a Muslim majority country that brought the case with the backing of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation as a form of, I think, eminently defensible solidarity against the background of a commitment to universalism with fellow Muslims being persecuted in a far-flung part of the world. Anyhow, so these particular manifestations of solidarity suggests a vision that is anchored in kin links, in affiliations, in historical legacies, in empathy across borders between particular peoples and transnational communities, a form of brotherhood or sisterhood that I think we should welcome and not see as a kind of awkward fit within international law sort of dominant cosmopolitan narrative. I think it's still a path to universalism, even if it's an idiosyncratic and convoluted one. But the key insight is that this solidarity, perhaps all solidarity, is almost by definition never with the entire world. Solidarity with the whole world is just restating the cosmopolitan promise, but it's too general for its own good. Whereas actually lived solidarity is about allyship and siding with one's equal, and in fact contesting bland universalism in the process. It's the opposite of top-down humanitarian solicitude and intervention. So having said that, and I'm aware that time is ticking, is that kind of solidarity, always peculiar as it is, always desirable? And let me suggest ways in which it might be and ways in which it might not be. Because I think we want to be careful that once we've said this, we don't fall into the trap of kind of fetishizing solidarity, even the solidarity that actually happens, right? Take the example of solidarity between states. Okay, so cooperation is great, but cooperation for what and with whom? Alliances are the clearest form of solidarity, although solidarity based on fear of the other, but they're only so good as they don't drag us into a world war, which, arguably they once did. And who will particularly regret the solidarity of Axis states, right? Solidarity could also be slightly ominous. What, after all, do states have in common when all is said and done, except their commitment to their own statehood? So it may be better for states to be in unison, but they could also be in unison in fundamentally perverse ways. The solidarity, if one can call it like that, of Operation Condor between South American states in repressing dissidents, the solidarity of irregular rendition and illegal detention sites for terrorists, the solidarity of arms contracts, do not exactly suggest shiny new utopias for international law. Indeed, there's a broader sense in which interstate solidarity might express merely the clinging by states to sovereign prerogatives for their own sake. R.J. Vincent once spoke of a Freemasonry of states, right? The idea that states have each other's backs against whatever might threaten them from outside. And, this is something we can see playing out at the UN, and maybe we could occasionally do without. Then there is also the overbearing and unwanted solidarity of the powerful, the solidarity of a civilizing mission. Spain and Portugal, France and the UK, at least recognizing themselves, whatever differences might exist between them, as in solidarity when it comes to rampaging across other continents. Solidarity also as something that cannot be reciprocated, that burdens its beneficiary with a debt of gratitude that it cannot repay. And this raises questions about whether there can be such a thing as unilateral solidarity. All these Sputnik deliveries, I hear San Marino in Italy, got a nice gesture from Putin when the EU wasn't forthcoming with its vaccines. Is Russia the new cosmopolitan empire, or just the imperial power of old? These, I think, are relevant questions. Then there's also domestically unwanted solidarity. Iranians impatient with the amount of money their government is giving to rebuilding highways in southern Lebanon, even as Iran is going through a major financial crisis. Vaccines donated internationally when not everyone is vaccinated at home. These are a reminder that international solidarity also has to contend with domestic duties and communitarian attachments. But then there are also forms of solidarity that briefly illuminate a path for international law that transcends the tension between universalism and pluralism. And I would include, first and foremost, the kind of prototypical, actually existing solidarity in the international system, third world solidarity, at least such as it once was. Consider, for example, the new international economic order. Most international lawyers today will say, well, the NIEO was a failure. It wanted to legislate solidarity of the West towards the South, and it utterly failed in that goal. But in the process, I think Third World Solidarity, the Group of 77, also illustrated and expressed its own form of successful solidarity, a solidarity of challenge to the dominant order. And ultimately, that moment of reckoning with oneself through solidarity may be as important as its ability to modify international law. And I'll come to the conclusion, beyond interstate relations, there's also the vast domain of transnational solidarities, intermediate solidarities between the state and individuals, but also between individuals. I have in mind, for example, Pan-Africanism and its relationships to struggles for Black liberation in the US and vice versa, as a form of solidarity directed at critiquing the international system through a realization of a profound similarity of fate between victims of colonialism and victims of slavery. There are also solidarities of nationalism or ethnicity, the solidarity of frustrated non-independent peoples, Quebec, Catalonia, Scotland, Karabakh, and many others. The solidarity of small island states threatened by global warming, the solidarity of non-nuclear powers, the solidarity of the state of origin and diasporas, the solidarity of enemies, even. I'm reminded of that moment when Israel offered humanitarian assistance to Iran and Iraq following earthquakes there. And then there's also the cheeky but powerful solidarity of Chavez, who once sent heating oil to the poor in the US during the Bush years. And there's also what Obiora Okafor has called human rights-based international solidarity, the solidarity of cities with migrants, of indigenous peoples between themselves as peoples defined by a peculiar common historical experience, the solidarity of women, the solidarity of persons with disability, solidarities of victimhood, all those a far cry from the broad, hypothetical solidarity of the international system at large. These are instances of solidarity at a cost, a solidarity with actual struggles that may draw on international law, but are not reducible to it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Frédéric, for your great presentation. Paolo, you are with us?
Yes, I'm here. So I would like again to reiterate my thanks for Professor Mégret being here with us and for his wonderful inaugural speech. As I was expecting, the expectations of this speech are met. and more than met. And so Professor Mégret has been able to cover such a different aspects, from the theories to the conceptualization to the practical examples in different area of international law. And so I believe that this is really a great introduction for the forum, for this research forum on solidarity, and how Professor Mégret has also described solidarity is also extremely valuable and fruitful for all the conversation that will continue today and tomorrow. I feel I've already spoken enough in the introduction, but I just want again to state the thanks of myself, of the entire, on behalf of the entire board, for this wonderful welcoming inaugural speech for the Research Forum. Thank you, Adriana.